Brian Pope. Come up on your feet so people can see you, Brian.
I feel a bit like super today, actually. But
I first heard Brian speak about 3 or 4 years ago at a Civil Aviation Historical Society meeting, and I was pretty impressed. I discovered that you could take 2 hobbies or more than 2 hobbies and join them together. Brian has taken philately, stamps, covers, I think he calls
postal
them.
history.
We would call it an envelope with a stamp on it's been through the system. He calls it a cover. There's postal history, there's history of aircraft, all sorts of things get melded into one. And you become a detective as well as you research these covers and stamps. So Brian will be speaking on international airmails from Western Australia 1924 to 1940. Over to you, Brian.
You've been staring at this, and perhaps you all know what the 1940 bit is, the cut-off date, obviously the beginning of the war, but you may be wondering what on earth 1924, before I was born. Several things happened in 1924. Kingsford-Smith and Keith Anderson bought a truck and set up the Gascoigne Trucking Company at Carnarvon. He was flying up and down as well for Briley. And they got the mail contract between Carnarvon and what I call Bangamall. Some people might call it Banjamal, I don't know. It's like Good Enough Island. Is it good enough or good no? I don't know. That was one of the things that happened. 1924, also the Northwest Air Route was extended to Perth. It had previously, up to that stage, been terminating at Geraldton because the government wanted the railways to get a bit of the income from it. It was extended to Perth. That happened early in 1924, and at the same time Wim Creek was included as a stopping place. So things were happening locally. What also happened was Western Australia's first access to airmail internationally. The definition that I more or less use here is if it was a service that the PMG's department advertised was available and gave postage rates for, then it fits in. This first one happened to be in America, in the US. The American Army offered the US Post Office 100 of these DH-4s, war surplus. Some of them still in their crates, spare engines, spare parts you'd die for today, and they were building a lot of them subsequently and had been building them in America. And this thing became the workhorse of the US postal airmail bit. And it was that way for about 7 or 8 years, and then eventually they got a design of their own. In this form, it's a single, you can see the pilot. When it was in its Army, its Air Force form, it had 2 cockpits. The front one was the pilot, and the one at the back was for a navigator. They were extensively modified for mail carriage, including just moving the pilot back to the second one. The front compartment was made where the mail went. About 400 pounds weight would fit. The original fuselage was fabric. This is de Havilland for, in World War I. They changed that to plywood. They strengthened the frame and the undercarriage and made quite significant alterations to them, and they all went very well. And they didn't cost anything, so what more could the Post Office wish for? Where we get to 1924, the US Post Office had for a long time been contemplating a transcontinental service from across America, depending on which way you like to go: New York, Chicago, Cheyenne, San Francisco. More importantly, in our case, it's the other way: San Francisco, Cheyenne, Chicago, New York. This was done in these 3 zones. Each zone was divided into relay stations. The whole thing had 7 relays, and there was a fresh pilot and a fresh plane at each of these 7 relay points. And they got this thing more or less up and running, and Congress, which is the holds the purse strings, declined to vote the relevant money to finish off navigation beacons, because there were going to be night flying involved. and that was in 1923. And so the post office quietly proceeded and constructed a lot of the infrastructure. These beacons, they finished up having one every 15 miles, big electric light thing. And come 1924, Congress came to the party and voted the money. And this service started on the 1st of July, 24. Started from both ends at once, operated quite well. Postage was 8 cents per zone per half ounce. So if you're sending something from San Francisco to New York, you paid 24 cents. We'll see one example of an 8-cent stamp for one zone. The thing started off quite well. These things had a top speed of 125 or so and a range of 250 miles. So there were a lot of changes, and the actual volume of the mail was not huge. They were in bags and they were just chucked in. Australia got to learn of this in September 1924, and notices, official post office notices. The features of it were that you could use American stamps or Australian stamps, and they gave the exchange rate in both sterling and in American money. So if you had American stamps, or more importantly, a bit later on, people from America, collectors, were sending covers to be posted here and posted back. And we get what Philatelist prize would call a combination cover. It's got both Australian and American stamps on it, or stamps of two different administrations. One of the things before leading this, there was a pretty horrendous attrition rate in the pilots. These were mainly ex-war pilots. There were plenty of them floating around in 1920s looking for work. And the figures I've got, and I don't know how it compares, but the figure was given in 1920 was 7.62 fatalities to 1 million miles flown. Now that 1 million miles is not just on this route, it's a whole lot of other routes were going on as well. And they, however it worked out, that was very high. They got it down by about half in the following year, 3.66, and then the following year it got down to 0.57. These advances were due to much better navigation. The pilots were getting more experience, and generally speaking, safety factors were being eliminated. The initial head of the Post Office Department, a chap called Prager, would say, fly or else. Doesn't matter about the weather, you just fly the bloody thing. And of course a lot of them fell out of the sky one way or the other, flying through snowstorms and so on. So 1924 was the first scheduled one, and Australia joined in September 24. It took about 30 hours on average going west to east, and about 35 going east to west, just headwinds basically. We can now look at one of these things. That's one of these you can recognise the propeller. There's one up there. 8 cents, that was for one zone. It's going to Cheyenne, which was the first zone. That's one of the first 3 or 4 from Perth that we have in this period. They're only, for Australia-wide, we only know of 9 in this very first period. So they're pretty scarce canaries. I don't own this, unfortunately. The last time it sold was over $2,000. So you need a deep pocket to get too enthusiastic if you want to. The zonal system, these 3 zones eventually stopped and they settled on a flat rate variously around, which reduced, and this one, there was confusion. Like that stamp there is an Australian airmail stamp, threepence. This threepence was applied to every item posted in Australia, irrespective per route of where it was going at this time. So Geraldton to Derby cost you threepence, and anywhere you went in that row was threepence. And when Qantas started, we had 2 routes going, so if you wanted to run one here and one in Camberwell and for Qantas in following year, it cost you 6pence for this. This airfare went to the Defence Department, allegedly for the construction of emergency landing strips and facilities, allegedly. The figures that I've got, the Defence Department copped £200,000 by 1935. Now, pilots of the day would assure you, I'm sure, that where's the best landing strip nearby in an emergency? You wouldn't easily find it. So what they were spending it on, well, what goes on inside politicians' minds and cabinet is one thing, and what gets out into the public is another thing, as we all know. But there was a lot of money in that threepence. And the 5-cent American thing, that there is one of these beacons. And that stamp is actually called a beacon stamp, just for convenience. The cover itself is 3 cents underpaid. There was confusion. The rate in Australia was advertised at 8 cents, and people were sending, this would have come from America undercover. Flum was a well-known aero philately collector, dealer. He'd send that out with stamps, with the American stamps, to an agent here. They'd put the Australian ones on, that's the tuppence plus a penny, the threepence. That was the overseas surface rate. If you're sending a letter to America by surface mail, threepence it cost you. America, for some reason or other, we've never found one of these penalised for being underpaid. It's a bit like today, you know, you can put anything on a letter through Australia Post and nobody picks it up. 5 cent again, they put out this envelope, what we call postal stationery. Again, you see the threepence for carriage from Adelaide to Perth, Perth to Adelaide in this case, and threepence for the overseas postage. Here's, you probably can't read it, this is a set was issued to commemorate Kingsford-Smith's exploits. 3 values, tuppence was the surface postage, threepence was the foreign postage, and sixpence was is the only one that's in, you probably can't read it, it says airmail and postal postage air service. Sorry about this. It has one of the distinctions that it was one of the few sets of stamps issued then or since that you could use a lot on a proper, correctly rated cover. Registration costs threepence, surface postage costs threepence, tuppence, threepence to America, and the American air fee was the sixpence. Here's one in 28. The Imperial Air extended its service as far as Karachi. You flew from Croydon to Karachi, and Australia set up a scheme whereby it went by ship from Fremantle to Colombo, then overland, from Ceylon across, and then overland to Karachi, and then onwards by mail to London. That cost you an extra sixpence. In this case, met by 3, one for the Australian bit, getting from Broome to Perth, and the other 2 for the bit from Karachi to Croydon, and the 2 tuppence surface postage. It was quite a good scheme, and it was used quite a lot per Karachi's London air mail. 1931 was a big year for trying to develop these things. There were 4 experimental so-called airmail services. This was one of them, first official airmail flight. This is from Australia, in this case obviously to Scotland. It had a special rate, which I think was 1 9th from memory, and again these were flown all the way to Darwin. Went to the eastern states. Mail from here had to go to Melbourne to connect with them. At the same, more or less the same time, KLM, the Dutch company, had been since 1928 or so flying with clockwork regularity from Amsterdam to Batavia. No troubles, Bing, fortnightly service, weekly service, no sweat. Now, really tried to establish tried to get into an agreement with KLM, but set up a branch service which would come to Wyndham, and from Wyndham he would distribute throughout WA Airways to Australia, the rest of Australia. The government of the day was very opposed to this, as was Hudson Fish and Qantas, and they had a lot of clout The Postmaster General of the day was a chap called Texas Green, who was the member for Kalgoorlie, and he was all in favour of it. He said, oh, Wyndham, obviously, that's the place to call. Wyndham had problems. It didn't have a very good airport, fairly marshy, and not that Darwin had very much better at that time. The Australian government had trouble with land planes flying over water. Not that any of them fell in, the flying boats that fell in eventually, but there was this large stretch of flying over water to get from Batavia to Wyndham, and as it didn't happen, but it would have had the locals had enough clout to get past the political opposition. Anyway, KLM did this thing. This is a return one on their return flight. One of the deterrents was that a very high rate of postage set was 3 and 4 pence per item. I'm very happy with this one because it's actually what we would call a commercial cover. It's addressed to Schofield Thing and Sons, Birmingham. So it probably had some business information in it. This one is really much more of a souvenir. The Commissioner for Railways, I really think he did not have approval to use these stamps. I don't know whether you can see, but the perforated OS there, you can, these are actually holes in the stamp. We call them perfins, perforated initials, IN, in the jargon, perfins. And they were for government business only. Now, I'd take a bit of leg pulling to make out that that was sent on government business, but nonetheless, it went. There were this special thing here we call the cachet. There were two of these. One was in Perth and the other one was in Sydney. We can tell the difference, that just the way the shape of the letter M allows us to tell, because the Perth ones were for mail going up to Wyndham and making the connection with Pathurst going home from Sydney, flew up through Queensland and eventually across to Wyndham, and we joined up there in this instance. The Kingsford-Smith, that's the Kingsford-Smith stamp there, but it was only what was called a commemorative, on issue for a limited time, and so they used the same design but changed it to airmail service and made it an airmail. This particular one is Ansett A&A, by this time late 31, had basically given up its interstate services, and they decided to mount a Christmas mail which was supposed to get to England and in time for Christmas and back again in time for Christmas. It had again a special rate, which is shilling from memory. Oh, we haven't got there. This is the one that crashed at Alor Star in Kedah on the way back. This is the return flight. Almond flew from here in the southern, I always get these confused, Southern Sun. It crashed at Alor Star and couldn't go on, and Kingsford-Smith flew in the Southern Star, went to Alor Star and flew on to London, picked up the mail in Kedah and went on. There were problems coming back. Scotty Allen had a mishap when he was flying in England, not to this plane, and so the departure of the return flight was delayed. It eventually got here in mid-January, but it was A&A saying, okay, here's the first all-Australian airmail, and they had this special airmail flight, Australia to England. This is just diverting a little bit. The UPU stands for Universal Postal Union. It was set up in been going since 1870s for ordinary surface mail, ship mail, but it got an airmail function, and it had procedures for underpaid mail. This is underpaid. It was addressed to Egypt, and it needed another penny. It cost you 1 6 to post a letter to England, to Egypt, which is halfway, cost you 1 7, foreign country. So it was penny short, and the Egyptian authorities slugged it tax due, and the agents paid it. And that T mark there says tax to be paid, and that's there is probably a penny, like a 1D, a symbol. There were normally, depending on the time it was before it was reposted, there may well have been a fee attached there, but there's nothing apparent on this one. It was probably done straight away, and away it went. Here's much the same sort of thing. The postage rate at this time was 2 shillings, I almost said 2 bob. I'm sure you'd all understand what 2 bob was. 2 bob for the first half ounce, and 2 and a penny for the next half ounce. So something weighing between half an ounce and 1 ounce, 2 and a penny. Everybody misread these things. And, oh yeah, it's an overweight, put on 2 bobs, which they did. It's 4 shillings on that. That was a penny underpaid, but because the originating administration, i.e. Perth, didn't indicate anything on it, the recipient country, Switzerland, didn't have to do anything about it. They could, but they didn't have to. If there was a T mark on it or some indication, they had to go about and collecting it. That was the good old days when something happened. Nowadays, if you send an underpaid mail through Australia Post to anywhere, and in the study group we've been trying to do this for 8, 9 years, we send out a journal internationally. We've been paying it with allegedly non-valid decimal stamps, and nothing gets picked up. Nobody looks at them these days. I mean, you're all familiar with the number of letters that come into your letterbox with no cancellations on them, I'm sure. I hope none of you use them again, though. In 1934, just to comment, the Imperial Airways came to Australia in December. They flew through. This was Imperial Air went to Singapore, and Qantas had the contract from Singapore to Darwin and down to the eastern states, Sydney. This meant that the West Australian one went to Daly Waters, where they made the connection with the thing going both ways, and it was the change in contract for that one as well. Mail going, this is by this service, mail going to intermediates, in this case Java, is really pretty scarce. I don't know why, but it is. That's just one to Java. And you can see it costs half the amount that it cost. You think where Java is, and then think where England is, it's only half the postage. They're making money somewhere. This one was from a ship called an Indian ship called the SS Mundra, and they were taking surveys of time, ocean current, directions, strength, etc. He put this thing in a bottle and tossed it overboard, and it was washed up 66 miles west of Albany. Somebody found it on the beach, and inside it says, if you send this thing to so-and-so and so-and-so, we'll repay you the postage. Now, whether he ever got the postage back, I really don't know, but he put threepence on it, and away it went, and it did, in fact, get to Calcutta. The other interesting thing about this is postcards by airmail are really quite scarce. They were not used very much. Postcards themselves are not private, but they cost usually half the cost of a letter. In this case, the cost was threepence as far as India. But finding postcards carried by airmail is a good feeling. This is incoming stuff. This was the crash at Lake Avinia, Calpurnia, one of the flying boats by this stage, came down. There's some sources say near Ramadi, and some say Lake Avinia. They're really, in fact, quite close. What it was, as far as I can make out, about a 20-mile stretch of marshy, reedy, fairly shallow water, and they got lost, and they came down, and it sank in about 8 feet, 10 feet of water. The mail was recovered, all of it. It was wet, but it was dried out. You can see the coverage bit. Now, Perth was the only one, Arnold, the Deputy Director, was the only one in Australia that put this sort of thing on one of these recovered covers. A couple of the other states did a letter with it, but he was the only one that had this. And he did it again. This was the one that, the Koranga, which took off from Katherine. It was Guinea Airways. They worked out that if the mail for South Australia was offloaded at Darwin, and Guinea Airways got that contract to go down to Adelaide with that lot, and the rest went on for the Sydney, Victoria, Queensland, and Guinea Airways won and came to us here. He took off and it crashed, and Nobody survived that one, I regret to say, but the male did. Again, evidence of water submersion. This is the all-up empire rate. In 1939, England got all enthusiastic about reducing this 1 and 6pence charge. They were charging 1 and 3pence coming this way. They wanted to reduce their charge to a penny halfpenny. They wanted us to charge a penny halfpenny. Now, when you bear in mind that the internal air mile rate here, postage rate, was 2pence, charging a penny halfpenny to fly something from here to there was obviously not on. And Australia insisted on charging at least 2pence and insisted on adding its 3pence air fee to it. So we get to 5pence. Here's something that has 5pence. Now there's an extra 2pence on that. And the only thing I can think of is that it's a late fee. I found no publications about it. Probably noticed on the late fee letterbox, if you post this between 2 and 2:30, it'll cost you a penny. If you post it from 2:30 to 2:35, pay an extra penny and it will be taken. So far, no information. Here's another one, exactly the same situation, but this is after the all-up rate had been withdrawn and we reverted to 1 and 6pence. But again, we've got this extra 2pence on it, and this one was also censorship, which is coming in at that time. This is a wartime one. BOAC was running a feeder route from initially Penang and then Bangkok across to Hong Kong. And from Hong Kong you went on, Pan Am was operating there, etc. at this time. The Japanese occupied Shanghai in 1937, but the air mail schedule for 1938 still maintained a rate of 1 shilling for flying to Hong Kong and then onwards by surface. This, you can't actually see it, the back has a very faint arrival mark for Shanghai, so it actually got there. Certainly got to Hong Kong because that bit there is a Hong Kong censor opened by censor. It was also passed by censor before it left, and it has a Shanghai arrival on the back. Now, how it got from Hong Kong to Shanghai when Shanghai was occupied and half the country in between was occupied by the Japanese, I just don't know. Road, ship, don't know. Anyway, that was a wartime cover, and things started getting complicated. When war really got going, the whole sort of international air mail schedules initially virtually collapsed after Pearl Harbor, and were then gradually reinstated, a lot of forces aircraft. And that's all. Thank you. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, briefly, we're probably running a bit over. Oh no, running on time. Any question? I'm quite happy. Or he's got one. Ha ha ha. Cool.
1931. Supposed to be.
Yeah, mail experiment. Yeah, that'd be right. Yeah, May. That's the second one. Yeah, that'd be right. Yep, that'd be. Yeah. That's an inward. It's an inward one from England by one of these special experimental ones in 31. The second one from Imperial Air in May. Yeah, no, that's good. It's condition. We get a bit het up about condition. This one's a bit raggedy around the edges. You probably kept it in your pocket, and if you look the other way, I'll put it in my pocket. It would be right, won't we?
It was sent to my grandmother.
Yeah. No, that's the Dinkamore. They're sought after, but you really need ones that are in better nick.
Well,
hang on to it.
On the email, they had first cover.
Yeah, well, it is for that particular flight. Yeah.
I noticed in the second or third slide you put up there, you had a stamp and it said grow more wheat.
Yep. That's called a slogan postmark. That particular one is relatively scarce. The post office was nation building, grow more wheat, exhorting all the farmers to grow more wheat, which they did. There were any numbers like use postage stamps, send post mail early for Christmas, use the telephone. They're a whole area of study in themselves. They're quite a good reflection of the social norms of the day. What was important to the government? Grow more wheat. Fair enough. Yeah. Any others? No. Oh, yeah. Lucky last.
Email, say, to Europe, would fly to England first, and then the European airlines would take it to Prague or whatever it might be.
Generally speaking, yes. This lot you could pay. Ultimately, you could pay all the way by air, but the usual thing was to go to London and then across the Channel. But the cross-Channel ones, there were any number of, several possibilities. I mean, Air France was flying, KLM was flying, Ala Littoria was flying. They were coming into London. London was even then a big hub. But as time went past, there was the potential to pay here for an airmail letter all the way to Austria or whatever. Yeah. Good. Ah, thank you. Good.